The Airlift Tanker Association is privileged to have Major General Retired Maggie Woodward giving a presentation titled Commanding an Air Campaign, a Mobility Leader's Perspective on Operation Odyssey Dawn, filling our Seminar 1 slot. We hope you enjoy this presentation. Thank you for joining us today. If you are not an ATA member, please consider joining at https://atalink.org/become-a-member. The views expressed in this presentation are those of the speaker and do not reflect the official policy or position of the United States Air Force, the Department of Defense, the United States government, or the Airlift Tanker Association. Please take advantage of the question and answer feature in Teams to submit your questions anytime during the presentation. There is no need to wait until the end of the presentation portion to submit your questions. Also, make sure to like questions by clicking the thumbs up icon. That way we know what you want to hear about.
Good morning and good afternoon, members and guests of the Airlift Tanker Association. I'm retired Major General Maggie Woodward, and I'm honored to bring you the stories of the airmen of Odyssey Dawn. As a lifetime member of ATA, I know firsthand how important this organization is to building the mobility leaders and systems we need for tomorrow. General McNabb, Chief Curver, and all the volunteers that make this organization work are true servant leaders. My thanks to them all. Operation Odyssey Dawn was groundbreaking in many ways. Much attention was paid to the fact that I was the first female JFAC of an air campaign. Still others focused on the idea that Odyssey Dawn was commanded by a mobility officer. But what was really significant was that Odyssey Dawn was driven by a unique UN mandate employing the new doctrine of responsibility to protect citizens from their own government. Further, Odyssey Dawn was executed without any coordination with ground forces because we could not be seen as supporting the rebels. And finally, Odyssey Dawn was essentially conducted with forces available in place because the situation evolved so quickly and with so many diverse viewpoints regarding the decision to get involved that buildup was just impossible. Needless to say, there were lots of lessons learned. I've given this presentation to audiences worldwide, but today I'd like to highlight just a couple of the lessons I think most meaningful to this audience. First, while we're a small Air Force, the stories of our airmen are enormous. Second, although 17th Air Force was established as a mobility-centric command focused on humanitarian operations, it was actually the second most kinetic command in the Air Force before Odyssey Dawn. That meant that every airman needed to understand full spectrum operations, and they did because they were full spectrum airmen. An example of this was then Colonel Steve Hart. Steve was a tanker nav who, as my KOC director, with almost no time, pulled together 4 separate combined air operations centers into one incredibly capable team, executing one incredibly important mission. So to say this again, everyone is an airman first, and while we should all be proud of our weapon system and career field, those things do not define us, nor do they confine us. We must be broadly educated to ensure we can meet every challenge we face. Now, since I want to save time for questions at the end, let's get started. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak today about Operation Odyssey Dawn, the US-led portion of the Libyan air campaign. My last visit to Africa was to Libya at the invitation of their air chief in April 2012, just months after the conflict had ended. I met with all their senior military leadership, and it was clear they were extremely appreciative that we had preserved their infrastructure and had immense respect for what we had been able to accomplish with air power. They were particularly impressed with our precision capabilities. The air chief told me that he had personally seen an underground aircraft shelter that contained an aircraft and 2 other pieces of age equipment. He was amazed that through the hardened bunker, we'd been able to destroy the aircraft, but leave the rest intact. And I didn't have the heart to tell him that that was all pure luck. We just let them believe. Well, like all successful air operations, Odyssey Dawn at its core is about superbly trained, highly skilled, and courageous airmen who met every challenge they were given. Thank you again for allowing me to tell their story. On the 18th of December 2010, political protests began in Tunisia that led to one of the most rapidly developing movements toward regional democracy in history. Dubbed the Arab Spring, courageous citizens challenged established autocracies across North Africa and the Middle East. Over the next 6 weeks, we monitored the unfolding situation and primarily prepared to support the State Department with non-combatant evacuations and humanitarian assistance. On February 15th, armed protests spread to eastern Libya, and 3 days later, protesters known as the opposition took control of the eastern city of Benghazi. Even as the opposition gained momentum, Colonel Gaddafi and his regime continued to brutally fight to maintain and regain control of their country. On February 21st, our State Department ordered the evacuation of American citizens. 2 days later, international concern grew after news reports of hundreds of protesters killed by Libyan airstrikes in Tripoli. And when Gaddafi ordered his army to hunt down and execute protesters door to door following heavy fighting in Benghazi. February 25th marked a significant turning point in our relationship with Libya when we completed the evacuation of U.S. citizens and President Obama signed an executive order initiating U.S. sanctions targeted at the Gaddafi government and condemning the violation of human rights, the brutalization of its people, and the outrageous threats that had rightly drawn the strong and broad condemnation of the international community. On the 26th of February, the United Nations adopted Resolution 1970, which, among other things, demanded an end to the violence in Libya, referred Libyan acts of aggression to the International Criminal Court, and called on all states to provide humanitarian assistance to the Libyan people. Almost simultaneously, we received our first planning guidance, directing us to deliver plans for a no-fly zone to U.S. Africa Command and the Joint Staff within 36 hours. As a result, 17th Air Force initiated 24/7 operations and began planning in earnest for what would ultimately become Operation Odyssey Dawn. From the start of crisis action planning to our first strikes in Libya was just 21 days. Further complicating the brief planning timeline was the fact that Libya had not been viewed as a potential adversary by most defense and intelligence agencies for years, making operational data and intelligence one of our earliest and most critically limiting factors. In addition, given the enormous risks associated with conducting military operations of any kind in Libya, and with the complex and competing national interests at stake during this time of spreading revolution in North Africa, almost no one in Washington publicly seemed to believe we would actually execute this mission. As a result, almost every day brought new planning guidance with new objectives, approaches, and priorities. All this and much more made the 21 days immediately prior to Odyssey Dawn immensely challenging. This challenging environment had a significant impact on how we developed plans, obtained resources, and ultimately employed air power in Libya. Would we have liked more time to plan? Yes. Would we have liked a more refined end state? Certainly. But we understood why these things weren't forthcoming, and regardless, history is clear. This operation was a great success. It was a success because the entire joint and coalition team was flexible, disciplined, professional, and highly responsive to rapidly changing guidance and conditions. And it was a success because when all was said and done, air power decisively stopped the Libyan regime from massacring tens of thousands of Libyan citizens in Benghazi without the loss of a single coalition serviceman or woman. The bottom line is that Odyssey Dawn once again proved that air power provides our leaders sovereign options they simply can't get anywhere else. From the beginning of crisis action planning, it was evident to us that any course of action involving a no-fly zone would require establishing air superiority and freedom of maneuver. To achieve these, we needed to eliminate the threats posed by a fairly robust Libyan integrated air defense system and a relatively incapable but still potentially lethal air force. In addition, our view of the mission led us to believe that sustained precision engagement with regime ground forces, as well as counter-air operations, would be required. After all, just as every combat operation since Martins, Spads, and Fokkers were first employed in the skies of Europe, our ability to dominate Libyan ground, sea, and air battle space was a fundamental part of our strategic plan. This meant we had to render both the Libyan integrated air defense system and the Libyan Air Force operationally irrelevant. Operating for more than a decade in the Middle East without an air threat, the joint team may take air superiority for granted, but every subsequent campaign objective demanded it, and every airman flying into combat deserved it. Having now had the great privilege of serving as a JFAC, I can tell you domination of the enemy's air power was never optional in any plan we produced. And it's impossible for me to imagine a scenario where any soldier, sailor, airman, or Marine engaged in combat operations would believe it should be. This fundamental perspective and subsequent analysis of objectives were the foundations for our first course of action, the one we eventually executed. However, this course of action and all it meant in terms of resources and operations also became the source of tremendous debate. For example, the first tasking we received called for us to establish and maintain a no-fly zone without any kinetic strikes in Libya. That meant we were planning to enforce a no-fly zone where a majority of missions would operate within range of multiple highly capable surface-to-air missile systems. Obviously, we developed the plan as directed, but assessed it as extremely high risk and offered our original COA as an alternative. Still, as planning continued, there appeared to be no public appetite from the administration for military intervention in Libya. For example, while explaining the challenges associated with intervention, U.S. Secretary of Defense Gates during congressional testimony said, "Let's call a spade a spade. A no-fly zone begins with an attack on Libya to destroy the air defenses," emphasizing that this would be a big operation in a big country. These words indicated that even though military operations were viewed as improbable, the debate regarding potential courses of action had already begun to shift toward our perspective that kinetic strikes to take out their IADs were an imperative. Concurrent with our efforts to plan for combat operations in Libya, we also developed options to provide humanitarian relief for the tens of thousands of refugees who were fleeing Libya and who had fled Egypt earlier in the spring. On March 3rd, the State Department formally requested assistance to support USAID in developing aid to Tunisia to help with both of these humanitarian crises. On March 5th, 86 Air Wing airmen flying C-130Js from Ramstein, combined with members of the 435th Contingency Response Group, to deliver 18,000 pounds of vital aid to the growing camps in Tunisia. Joining our Air Force C-130s were Marine KC-130s, which during the next 11 days returned over 1,100 displaced Egyptians to their homeland. These operations were important not only because they provided relief for the people of North Africa, but also because they provided a very visible reminder of American resolve and concern. And while humanitarian missions were underway, planning directives for the no-fly zone continued to evolve. Following the public statement from Secretary Gates that strikes in Libya would be required, we received new planning guidance directing development of a COA that would keep all Libyan regime aircraft from flying, just using one initial strike executed with limited defensive counter-air and suppression of enemy air defenses. In addition to these efforts, our staff was also closely working with U.S. Africa Command and the Joint Staff to develop other plans for a full spectrum of operations. Throughout this planning cycle, the situation in Libya continued to deteriorate. It appeared that unless the world acted, nothing would prevent Colonel Gaddafi and his lieutenants from committing mass murder in Benghazi. Then, on the 16th of March, just one day before it passed, we received a draft version of United Nations Security Council Resolution 1973. Under this resolution, our potential mission grew in both scope and urgency. Not only did the resolution call for a sustained no-fly zone, it also had a mandate to protect civilians. Tactically speaking, this meant many things over the long term, but once the resolution passed, there was no doubt our immediate concern would be to prevent regime forces from reaching Benghazi. With just hours to develop a concept of operation using whatever resources were most readily available, I began to understand Nelson Mandela's perspective when he said, "It always seems impossible until it's done." Perhaps the most challenging constraints we dealt with in the development of our strategy were related to resources. While we requested resources as early as possible in the planning cycle, we only received a small portion of the validated requirement, and mostly after execution began. For example, critical enablers such as AWACS, JSTARS, and additional tankers arrived well after combat operations were initiated. In addition, while full motion video platforms, RPAs, were approved, they were not available until after we had handed off operations to NATO. Fortunately for us, we were in USAFE's backyard, and since AMC's backyard is global, we were in theirs too. As a result, 2 days before execution, EUCOM and TRANSCOM provided support to ensure AFRICOM and U.S. Air Forces Africa had the airmen and equipment necessary for combat operations. While this approach still limited our ability to execute as planned, this loaning of forces did provide the essential capabilities required for success. During the early morning of 19 March, Operation Odyssey Dawn began as we launched TLAMs from coalition naval forces at a variety of targets in Libya. As you would expect, the challenges we faced throughout combat operations were enormous and would require our airmen, sailors, and Marines to perform nearly flawlessly in complex, high-stress, and exceptionally demanding circumstances. And as you would expect from the greatest airmen in the world, they did just that. In the course of 13 days of combat, those airmen would successfully use every one of Air Power's 6 distinctive warfighting capabilities. Allow me to give you a few examples. Because we had no viable basing options in Africa, we chose our base in Aviano, Italy, led then by Brigadier General C.Q. Brown, as one of our primary staging bases. Almost immediately, over 1,500 airmen and sailors converged on the base, stretching force support, civil engineering, communications, security forces to incredible lengths. Within days, the base fitness center was converted into a lodging hall accommodating hundreds of new arrivals, and buildings mothballed and waiting demolition were furnished and brought to standards necessary to meet operational requirements. Aviano's food service team expanded operations by 400%, tailoring service to meet the unique dietary requirements of our coalition partners and increasing flight meals from around 28 to over 3,200 per day, all from bare base facilities constructed by the civil engineers. Transportation shuttles began operating 24/7 requirements, and the operations center and flight line roared to life. A decommissioned runway and parking apron were restored sufficiently to accommodate aircraft parking and a huge influx of cargo and supplies, all within days and without a single augmentee. This was truly an extraordinary effort by an extraordinary team. While the base at Aviano was ramping up, AMC and USAFE were developing creative ways to provide tanker support for Odyssey Dawn. To give you an idea of the distances we were dealing with, flying a sortie against targets in Libya would be the equivalent of flying F-16 missions from Ellsworth, South Dakota, to fly close air support over Del Rio, Texas, supported by multiple air refuelings from tankers launched from Seattle. Fighter sorties against Libyan targets averaged 8 hours and required 5 air refuelings to generate just 1 hour on station. Although we tasked our tankers in our initial request for forces, they were not yet approved. As a result, USAFE loaned us additional theater forces, and Transcom stepped up by holding tankers in Europe that were scheduled to transition to the United States and established the tanker bridge critical for logistics support and global strike missions. Under the leadership of the Air National Guard, KC-10 and KC-135 operations from 34 units were consolidated at one location, giving the 313th Air Expeditionary Wing the nickname the Calico Wing. More than 50 Calico crews rapidly coalesced into one incredible team, flying day and night, flawlessly supporting Odyssey Dawn. This was an operation of thinkers and doers, with each airman displaying great professionalism and flexibility on every sortie. Collectively, these airmen offloaded 17 million pounds of fuel in support of air operations against Libya. Now, I'm sure you've all heard the motto, nobody kicks ass without tanker gas, and this was definitely true for Odyssey Dawn. Since minimizing collateral damage was a primary objective, precision targeting was absolutely critical. To successfully strike just one target from thousands of feet, traveling at hundreds of knots in all types of weather, and without unnecessary risk, without loss of an airman, and while minimizing collateral damage, and without appearing to seek regime change, and consistent with the law of armed conflict, is like trying to pull a rope through the eye of a needle. Of course, trying to render an enemy air force irrelevant without striking precisely the right targets in precisely the right sequence is impossible. So fortunately, our Air Operations Center team, coupled with the incredible professionals of the Air Force Targeting Center, pulled a rope through the eye of a needle more than 700 times. In my estimation, our ability to rapidly find, fix, and target the enemy was a game changer during Odyssey Dawn, and is perhaps every bit as distinctive an Air Force capability as the 6 we currently claim. To execute initial strikes against Libyan regime aircraft, we tasked 3 B-2 bombers from Whiteman for global strike missions. This permitted us to ensure operational security and execute combat sorties without concern for potential host nation restrictions, allowing us time for the political landscape to gel. Even then, in order to ensure we met time over target requirements, we had to launch all 3 aircraft without an execution order. And some 6 hours into the flight, following their first of 4 air refuelings, the order finally came. And 13 hours after departure, our B-2s engaged regime targets in Libya. This was a complex mission. Besides the great distances involved, it required concurrent and fully integrated operations with Strike Eagles from Lakenheath, CJs from Spangdahlem, 135s from Mildenhall and the Northeast Tanker Task Force, and Growlers from Aviano. But once again, our airmen made the complex look easy. As you can see from these photos, these perfectly executed global strike missions helped us establish the conditions required to sustain a no-fly zone and protect the people of Libya from slaughter. As you would expect, nearly concurrent with these global strike missions, our plan called for us to protect Libyan citizens in earnest. In a very real sense, this meant we immediately had to engage the enemy where the threat was greatest, in Benghazi. Because we needed to virtually eliminate the chance of collateral damage, we used dynamic targeting and strike coordination and reconnaissance, or SCAR, tactics to search for and destroy enemy forces. With about 24 hours notice, our first SCAR missions, consisting of a package of Strike Eagles from the 48th Fighter Wing and CJs from the 52nd Fighter Wing, were airborne. While the majority of Libya's integrated air defense system had been disabled at this point, a tactical threat still remained. In fact, as the SCAR package approached Benghazi, an SA-8 tactical surface-to-air missile system went active. Of course, as soon as this system went active, so did our CJs, and as you can see from this video, things did not go well for the SAM. In addition, the location of the SAM provided a superb mark for our sniper pods, helping our Strike Eagles locate and slam Gaddafi's elite 32nd Brigade with over 12,000 pounds of munitions. In my view, this was the turning point in our initial efforts to save the people of Benghazi because it stopped Gaddafi's ground forces in their tracks and allowed subsequent targeting of regime forces where collateral damage could be minimized. Once our initial SCAR package completed its mission, Harriers from the USS Kearsarge took over and continued to pound regime forces in the area.
She's on the road outside Benghazi with a convoy that was just hit. Oh, well, what can you tell us?
Well, Richard, according to eyewitnesses, this convoy was hit by fighter jets at around 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning. The vehicle, the debris is strewn over an area that stretches for kilometers. This is a convoy of Gaddafi's military that eyewitnesses are saying was trying to make yet another advance onto Benghazi. They have one message, and that is thank you. And they want the world to know that this strike by those foreign fighter jets has been right on target. They want to make that very clear because they know that Gaddafi's propaganda machine has been saying that Western powers have been hitting civilian locations, have been causing civilian casualties. They want people to know that this was a strike right on a military convoy.
Of those military strikes, and now what you're seeing with this attacked convoy. So one assumes that the attack on Benghazi has at least been halted for the time being.
Exactly, Richard. That is exactly what has taken place. And many people will say to you that if these foreign fighter jets weren't in the air, if these strikes hadn't been happening, there would be a battle raging for Benghazi once again.
The execution of dynamic targeting required a clear operational picture, uninterrupted communications, and responsive and flexible command and control. These key enablers were provided principally by AWACS and JSTARS, which contributed to the common operating picture that extended from the AOC to our tactical aircraft. Their job was to orient shooters, pair shooters with targets, solve battle space problems, speed accurate decision-making, and bring order to what could easily become chaos, and they did precisely that. For example, toward the end of Odyssey Dawn, we received reliable intelligence that regime forces were massing and moving north toward the opposition-held town of Brega. AOC's senior offensive duty officer coordinated with JSTARS and confirmed the enemy was preparing for offensive action. As a result, we drafted a 10-line tasking order and passed it to the JSTARS for execution. A two-ship of Strike Eagles patrolling near Brega responded and struck the convoy, destroying between 20 and 25 vehicles, multiple artillery and AAA pieces, and killing numerous enemy forces. The total time between receipt of the intelligence inside the AOC and completion of that strike was only 22 minutes. No other Air Force in the world could do that. Of course, not everything went as planned. On the night of Monday, 21 March, while engaging a surface-to-air missile site, one of our Strike Eagles crashed. With 2 airmen down behind enemy lines, the next several hours were probably the most stressful of any during Odyssey Dawn. While Vipers, Harriers, and additional Strike Eagles circled the crash site, we established radio contact with the pilot and searched for the weapons systems officer. Using techniques learned years before in survival training and continuously updated since, the pilot managed to evade suspected enemy soldiers on foot and in vehicles for more than an hour. At times, they were so close that we could hear their dogs barking and even their voices in the background of our pilot's transmissions. And while the pilot clung to his freedom, CAP aircraft in the vicinity, with support from ISR platforms, had to interpret the situation and provide supporting fire, sometimes just a few hundred feet from our airmen. And with another downed airman in the area, but not yet in contact with the coalition, the need for balance between caution and kinetics was obviously paramount. Almost immediately after we received word of the crash and confirmed that our airman was evading, our Marine trap team launched from the USS Kearsarge, flying at maximum speed to enemy-held territory in their Osprey. They flawlessly located the downed pilot who had managed to make his way to a suitable pickup point. Executing an absolutely textbook combat recovery, the trap team took the pilot to the Kearsarge, where he was treated for minor injuries. Our Wizzo was picked up by the rebel forces and ultimately transferred via boat to coalition forces in Sicily. As you know, this was not just a joint operation, it was also a coalition operation, and one of the most challenging aspects of Odyssey Dawn involved coalition integration. Despite the fact that UN Resolution 1973 authorized unilateral action by any country, senior international military representatives began arriving on our doorstep almost immediately. In fact, we got a call from Norwegian F-16s while they were airborne, asking us where they wanted us to land, that they wanted to join our coalition. On the first day of operations, the French and British joined us, making us a loose coalition using 3 deconflicted but different air tasking orders. In the next 96 hours, we grew to 8 coalition partners, all tasked on a single ATO, operating with common ROE, airspace coordination plans, and spins. By day 10, the U.S. Air Force was providing command and control of combat operations involving 12 coalition partners. The speed with which this coalition grew was extraordinary and presented a major integration challenge since each partner came with unique employment caveats. However, each partner also came with unique capabilities that made us stronger than we would have been as individuals. From a dynamic targeting perspective, the UK in particular brought a very unique capability to our coalition, the dual mode seeker Brimstone. This missile is designed to be a low collateral damage weapon using a shaped charge producing little or no fragmentation. For example, in one Brimstone engagement, our RAF partners found a tank parked in an intersection located in a virtual urban canyon with multiple story buildings on all sides. The Brimstone allowed our UK pilots to literally thread the needle between buildings and destroy the tank with no collateral damage. Honestly, I initially had concerns about our ability to quickly and completely integrate all of the coalition members into the air order of battle and maintain a synchronized, coordinated effort. But the coalition performed spectacularly. On a daily basis, we were launching strike packages consisting of multiple nations with just the right mix of capabilities for a particular target set, every one of them with spot-on results. Time and again, the benefits of common operating procedures, compatible equipment, and common understanding of perspectives airmen with a history of working together were evident. This is clear evidence of the success and absolute necessity of building partnerships among allies through exchange programs, interfly agreements, exercises, and occasionally just sitting down for a glass of wine or beer. Overall, the coalition coalesced extremely well. Each partner respected the capability others brought to the fight. Each partner understood the need for unity of command. Each partner understood the need for a single joint force air component commander, and each partner deferred to the United States to fill this role because each partner knew that only the United States Air Force had the capacity to command and control this fight. Nonetheless, as quickly as it began, our mandate ended, and we initiated transfer of control to NATO. In general, the transfer was adequately accomplished in the time we were given, but our inability to communicate with NATO using classified systems was a major limiting factor. Handing over operations in the middle of combat is tough enough, but not being able to effectively communicate during that is crippling. The seamless transfer of operational command and control was one of the most serious elements for our coalition partners. And although initially there were a myriad of command and control concerns, most notable was the lack of a common US-NATO secure data capability. Simply put, we could not communicate between the two AOCs because our systems were just not compatible. In fact, General Jodis, the NATO CFAC, and I had to communicate in the clear for several days until our combat communication experts were able to establish a workaround at the NATO Command Center. I must admit that during this time, during the waning hours of Odyssey Dawn, it was impossible to avoid reflecting on what our team had accomplished. Collectively, in just 13 days, we flew well over 2,000 sorties, launched more than 200 TLAMs, released thousands of pounds of munitions, saved tens of thousands of Libyan civilians from massacre, eliminated the Libyan Air Force as a threat, and met every other objective we were given, all without a single coalition loss. Collectively, this coalition was a success because it was composed of professional airmen from the world's greatest air forces. I don't know what the future holds, but the success of Odyssey Dawn may make the merging of air power with indigenous ground forces even more common in the future. This approach may help minimize risk and costs in many cases, but in my view, should never be considered a legitimate substitute for a truly integrated joint force. Instead, the template from Odyssey Dawn should inform doctrine and stand ready to serve as a basis for future combat operations where conditions warrant. In the meantime, let there be no doubt that the single most important lesson from Odyssey Dawn is that well-trained and professional coalition airmen are the single most important element in a successful air campaign. Despite near exhaustion, these airmen met the demands and challenges of our mission whenever and wherever called. And as the US President said when he addressed the nation, I want to begin by paying tribute to our men and women in uniform who once again have acted with courage, professionalism, and patriotism. They have moved with incredible speed and strength. In my view, these and many other attributes define the airmen who fought during Odyssey Dawn. I honestly don't know if there's a hero among them, but I do know that taken collectively, their efforts were heroic. They saved countless lives, made America justifiably proud, and in so doing, changed the course of history.
All right, now we will turn it over to General Woodward for question and answer. All right, ma'am, as soon as you unmute, we'll get started.
There we go. I thought that it would be, it's very timely to give this presentation and talk about Libya today, as they just signed a peace agreement and hopefully are moving towards a calmer path forward for their nation. And we'll keep our fingers crossed that it's the next step for Libya in their movement towards peace and stability. So I'm ready. Do you want me just to run down the questions here, Papa?
No, I've got them for you here, ma'am, and more are coming in. So the first one we're going to address is from Chad Mansky. He wants to ask the question, can you please address how the absence of a designated JFLIC during the operation may have handicapped the holistic planning and execution from a lack of land thinking perspective, despite the fact conventional ground forces were not intended to be introduced?
Thanks, Papa, and thanks for that question, Chad. It's actually one of my thumbs up on there, because I thought that was a great question to discuss. Yes, there was not a designated JFLIC. However, the U.S. Army Africa, the component commander for the Army in AFRICOM, was in essence the JFLIC that I worked with, even though he wasn't designated, just like I wasn't designated a CFAC. And so we worked with them on many plan developments, on, in particular, worked with him and SOC Africa on potential options for dealing with. Libya had a great deal of yellow cake, and there was a lot of concern about what we were going to do, whether we needed to send in special ops forces to manage that. We were working with lots of folks back in the States about whether it was safe for us to put munitions on it. So a lot of coordination, to be honest with you, on that issue in particular. So I didn't feel like the not having a designated JFLIC really handicapped our operational planning, but certainly, you know, my biggest LIMFAC was the lack of coordination with ground forces. And in fact, when we had lead, we were forbidden to have any kind of communication with the rebel forces whatsoever. With the thought being that, hey, if we coordinated with them, then it looked like we were throwing our hat on their side, whereas our mandate really was just to support the civilian populace and keep them safe. So we literally weren't even allowed to do any kind of coordination with them. Now, later on, as OUP advanced, NATO really changed the ROE on that, and they even went so far as having coalition soft forces on the ground, serving as JTACs and training for the rebel forces. So that helped improve that interface between air and ground. But like I said in the briefing, you know, we were able to get around it and work through it, but it was phenomenally challenging. And not something that, I mean, it may be, you know, attractive for the risk averse, but it's not something that I would ever recommend in the future.
Copy that, ma'am. We're going to switch over to another question here now. It's unfortunately from an anonymous person, but can you talk more about your assessment of Tanker C2 during Operation Odyssey Dawn? It would seem to be very complex for the CFAC for an air operation being conducted in AFRICOM with U.S. tankers based in EUCOM and some tankers under OPCON of TRANSCOM. The addition of coalition tankers to the mix made it even more complex, I'm sure. How did all that work for you?
Yeah, you know, and it was crazy. And after having been a squadron commander in Kosovo, where we really were upset with the KAOC for doing a terrible job of tanker planning. One of the things I said to the guys is, okay, I can't focus on the tanker piece, but please, I'm a tanker pilot. Don't screw up the tanker plan. And I'll be honest with you, the tanker plan was not optimized whatsoever. So, I can say pretty much I screwed that one up too. But it was phenomenally challenging. The airspace once again was difficult because we had aircraft coming from everywhere from England, Germany, Spain, Sicily, and a great deal from Aviano, having to fly down that corridor and then go through the tanker tracks in the Med. And like I said, the average fighter sortie had to have 5 air refuelings for 1 hour on station. So not only was air refueling absolutely critical to get the job done, but it was, supremely challenging. We had considerable issues with inter communications capabilities between us and coalition forces. We had French tankers, but we had very or no interoperability with them communications wise. So we ended up having to just use French tankers for French fighters, and deconflicting that and their tracks, and timing could be incredibly challenging. And then honestly, I won't say fight, but the tug and pull between USAFE and AMC about OPCON over tanker forces was a little challenging at times, and created some confusion, I would say, at the beginning, where we had TACC thinking that they were planning some of the tanker portion or tanker plans, while needless to say, I wanted to have all of that in the KAOC with our mobility division. So that became very difficult. And once again, I understand why we had the split OPCON and TACON, but I once again would not recommend that option whatsoever. I believe that everything should be consolidated in the KAOC, and then the AMD could push out requests from TACC and get their assistance, but it all has to be led, I believe, from one location, and I thought that was a little bit problematic. I hope that answers all that was in that question. If not, come back with more.
And ma'am, having been a deployed tanker squadron commander, I could agree wholeheartedly on the command and control all coming from one location. It's very difficult when you work for many masters. The next question is another anonymous one. It says, can you talk about some of the challenges you faced in transitioning the US-led OOD over to a NATO-led OUP? What was your role once NATO took over responsibility for the air campaign under Lieutenant General Jodis as the NATO CFAC?
Yeah, and let me start by saying Ralph Jodis is a very, very good friend, was before this, so I think that helped. Relationships matter, but it was incredibly challenging. I think he and I were both trying to figure out at the time if this was the first time anybody had ever transferred command of an operation in the middle of combat ops, especially pretty intensive combat ops. And that alone would have been, a remarkable challenge. But then the lack of communication capability was, incredibly difficult. And NATO had time to prepare, because we went into this. In fact, Admiral Locklear, the JTF commander, from the very beginning thought that NATO would run the campaign from the beginning. And we really took it and led it in the initial part just because we felt like they didn't have the capability at the beginning. So we knew we were always going to have to hand it over to them even before we started combat ops. And General Jodis and I had been working in the early days of, and so we shared with him all of the ROE, all of the spins, all of the airspace coordination plans, you name it, in order so that they had those to start with, and to go from that. We asked them to send over folks to the KAOC so that we could indoctrinate them before they stood things up at Poggio, where their KAOC was. And we would have liked them to have sent more so that they had a better understanding across more divisions. As we made the transfer, they sent a very limited number, and I think that hurt. I would recommend a lot more significant presence for that. And this is where I'm going to get very honest, is we had a little bit, we were supposed to transition, I think it was on the 31st of March. I remember it was a Wednesday, and some of our coalition partners had actually made a trip down to Poggio to check things out and to get prepared for the transfer, knowing that they would have to move down there once we transferred operations. And they ended up going down there on a Sunday, and the KAOC was closed down. This is the Sunday before assuming combat operations on a Wednesday. So you can imagine when they came home or came back to Ramstein with that information, and all of my coalition partners, almost all of which were NATO themselves, basically refused to transfer over to NATO control because they weren't confident in their ability to lead the fight, to be honest with you, at that stage. So it took a bit of convincing, a bit of working harder to lay the groundwork, and so we had to delay by a couple days in order to get our NATO partners comfortable with accepting the transfer. And then after the transfer, I'll be honest, we took a pretty big step back and helped the rebels for a brief period of time the Gaddafi forces make some ground. And then that's, I think, to be understood. Picking up operations in the middle are going to be pretty challenging. And they had, poor General Jodis had some constraints in his workforce. I mean, things like they had to have 15-minute breaks every so many hours, and limitations on personnel that were pretty difficult for him to have the high tempo of ops that we had been maintaining. So and their ROE was very challenging at the beginning, and it eventually evolved and gave him a lot more leeway in what he needed to do to recapture the initiative, and we were able to have tons of workarounds for the the communications capabilities or constraints that we had. We had a U.S. only portion at Poggio where we would send all our information, and they would end up somehow disseminating that as they could to the KAOC there at Poggio. So very challenging, and something that has really been taken on, and I hope has been made considerably better. For the year after that, when I worked there, we were all trying very hard to figure out a better interoperability between U.S. and NATO forces for the future.
All right, ma'am, we have 3 more questions, and you don't have anything after you. So with your permission, I'm going to go a little over time and get all 3 of these questions in.
Sure. My horse can wait. He's waiting.
All right. All right. Well, we don't want to keep the horse waiting too long.
Yeah.
So the next question is, what improvements has AMC made since Operation Odyssey Dawn to increase pilot SA and aircraft communication in combat operations? And I think we have a specialist on the line to help you with that question, but I'll let you lead it off.
Right, and that's a great one, and we've got Luke Green, I think, on board to answer those from an A5 perspective, to really give you some detail, since obviously things have gone a long way since I was in AMC. But I will tell you that how absolutely critical that is, as I'm sure most of you listening would know, especially in those really dangerous tanker plans where you've got so many aircraft going every which way, that SA is absolutely important. I know in Kosovo, we always had the fighter guys say that they thought the most dangerous part of their mission was the air refueling, not flying over downtown Sarajevo. So, that tells you how that goes. So with that said, I'm going to hand it over to Aaron, who I hope is up and can answer.
Yeah, actually, I think we've got Ken Graham from AMC here to join us. So Ken, go ahead and unmute, and let's hear what you have to say on that question.
Hi, ma'am. Ken Graham here from AMC A5. I'm a Airborne Networking Requirements Manager working with Lieutenant Colonel Lane. I'm also a former 89th Airlift Wing CSO when you were a commander there.
Excellent, excellent. Thanks for helping me today. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, so the math has really come a long way in the last decade to increase pilot SA and aircraft comms and combat operations. We still have quite a ways to go. We're still lagging behind the rest of the Air Force just a little bit, but improvements have definitely been made. Currently, for the C-17 and C-130J, we have a system called the dynamic retasking capability. What that does is provides a roll-on, roll-off tactical data link using saddle and JREAP alpha, giving the pilots some SA beyond line of sight there, so they're not out there flying blind. It also gives the commanders back at the KAOCs and at the AOCs the ability to reach out if plans do change and missions do change mid-flight. As you said in your briefing, flexibility was one of the keys to success out there. And this could have been something that could really help, mid-mission to get changes out to the crews. We're working with a number of different people. The Air Force Research Lab has also given us some systems that provide secure text chat over commercial SATCOM, and that's a global reach there. We also have a system called real-time information in the cockpit, where on KC-135s we're going to be introducing Link 16 on there and BLOS using JREAP alpha, just to give them a little more situational awareness out there, because as you just mentioned, the fighter is saying during air refueling that was the most dangerous time because they probably had their systems down. Well, in this case, the tankers can still be up monitoring what's going on around while they're in that track. The hope for that system is that it starts flowing over to the C-17, C-5, and C-130Hs, so we can get tactical data link on our entire fleet. The KC-46 and the C-130J are both being rolled out with new Link 16 systems and beyond line of sight capability for those. And we're also participating with HAF in the new JAD C2 effort, the Advanced Battle Management family of systems. We're looking to help them in their on-ramps to help prove their product line concepts and also help us identify roles we can play within that system and future requirements. So thanks for letting me jump on and give you that information.
Oh, great. Well, thanks. And you know how I feel about CSOs, so it's awesome to hear from you and everything you did in the past. I really appreciate it.
Yes, ma'am.
When you talk about those tanker SA, it brings up the point where we didn't even have AWACS for that first 5 days of combat ops. So you can imagine what it was like for those tanker crews in that incredibly busy area of all those tanker tracks right in the middle of the ingress and egress area into Libya, and how incredible that was without even having an AWACS for support. So all of those improvements are great. Nice to hear about.
All right, ma'am, we got 2 more questions for you. The next one is a pretty short one. It said, do you have a DIRMOB 4 and how was the relationship?
Oh, okay, that's a good question. Yes, definitely. We had a DIRMOB 4 and it was, I think, a great relationship. He helped considerably with, the issue we had brought up before where there was confusion about OPCON, TACON, and what USAFE had, what we had, what, TACC had, and you know, he absolutely did a fantastic job. So I think at one point somebody had originally said, "Oh, we don't need a DERMOB 4," and you know, at very early in the planning process, and I was like, "That's insane." You know, why would I not have a DERMOB 4? Because we're going to have, you know, tanker issues. We may not have a lot of airlift issues to deal with once we get started, but and absolutely was critical, and wouldn't have ever done without them.
All right, ma'am, and the last question is from a Lieutenant Colonel Chris Tuman. Ma'am, can you speak to any specific logistics shortfalls that required creative solutions?
Yeah, well, you could see that the entire operation was like one big logistic shortfall. You know, we didn't get any of the things we wanted or needed, but a really good one to start with was we wanted to. We really were on a short timeline because, as you saw in the briefing, Gaddafi's forces were marching up towards Brega. And if we didn't catch them in the desert before they got, or Benghazi, if we didn't catch them as they were marching up there, then we would have the urban fighting in Benghazi that would be next to impossible to deal with and protect civilians at the same time. So timing was absolutely critical, and we literally had 2 days from when we got the draft of the UN resolution that said this is what you're going to do to when we had to execute. So I needed to generate forces in place at Lakenheath and Spangdahlem, and then have them fly to deploy, so and employ to deploy, if you will. So they took off from Lakenheath, Spangdahlem, flew down, dropped their munitions, and then recovered in at Aviano. And the generation issue was next to impossible. And one of the reasons why we couldn't generate forces at Aviano and use those was because the Italians weren't letting us upload weapons. So we were dealing with host nation issues that, for instance, the Germans had were part of the AWACS group for NATO. We couldn't use the NATO AWACS because the Germans wouldn't support the operation. And initially the Italians said they'd be fine with letting us operate out of Aviano, but it took a while before we could get them to even approve us uploading munitions on our aircraft from our main operating base. So the creative workaround with that was that, you know, actually deploying them from their home stations and making an incredibly long mission for those guys. And, you know, but you can see how unbelievably skillful they were. They're still my heroes in being able to find the lead of that convoy out in the middle of the desert without any help from any JSTARS or or any kind of intel to give them SA for where that convoy was. So it made for pretty challenging, but the guys worked around it. You know, I also had a problem where they didn't want to generate in England, or actually General Welsh, the safety commander at the time, didn't want me to generate forces yet because he said that that would highlight what we were going to do. And my point was, well, we have to generate forces. We can't, we have to start now. We can't wait because that's how long it takes to generate forces. And he literally wouldn't approve his USAFE forces generating. And I had to go back to the AFRICOM commander, who thankfully was at the Pentagon that day, and he was able to go to the chairman, and between the two of them were able to make the direction to do the generation started then. If they hadn't, there's no way, I believe, we would have been able to stop the crews or the Gaddafi forces before they got to Benghazi. Another thing we had to do when you talk about relationships being important is a very good friend of mine was the deputy commander at STRATCOM, and another good friend was the 8th Air Force commander at the time. we had been talking for days or probably weeks about B2 engagements. They were dealing at the time, which I didn't even know, with putting the B2s on hold for a potential for the bin Laden compound. And so they were challenged in whether or not they were going to be able to give me the B2s I needed to take down the initial SA5 rings, the 5 SA5 sites we needed to take out. And so they were able to help me, and in fact, they launched the 3 B2s on their own orders before we actually got an execution order signed by the SecDef, and it wasn't. It took 6 hours after they had to take off before we got that. If they hadn't supported me and launched those aircraft at the time they did, we would have never been able to bring down the IADs that night. And once again, it would have slipped everything 24 hours, and that would have had Gaddafi in Benghazi. So those are really helpful.
All right, ma'am. Well, again, thank you so much. We're honored to have the Generals Woodward as part of our 2020 symposiums, and I hope that you will get to enjoy the rest of the seminars as attendees without the stress of having to connect and be on the camera for us. Chad Mansky did put in one last comment saying that as the sitting Mildenhall Wing Commander being sent to Marone to stand up the Calico Wing before the Pennsylvania Guard took over, the RFF system supported by you made his job a lot easier. So we can't thank you enough for joining us today and providing that insight. And like I said, I hope you and everyone else gets to enjoy the rest of the symposiums today. So thanks
so
again.
Much. Thanks, Chad, too.
Views expressed in this presentation are those of the speaker and do not reflect the official policy or position of the United States Air Force, the Department of Defense, the United States government, or the Airlift Tanker Association. If you are not an ATA member, please consider joining at https://atalink.org/become-a-member. Thank you for participating in our virtual presentation. Please close this window and return to the agenda on our website to view another presentation.